Yeah, there we go. It is now recording. Let me just admit a few stragglers. Thank you very much, Nicola, for telling me I'm doing a grand job. Right, now we're going to do the next technical thing, which is I'm going to try and share my PowerPoint with you. And it's in a different way to how I would normally share PowerPoint, but I tested it and it seemed to work. So you should see me at some point soon pop up in the corner like we're on a YouTube channel or a Twitch streaming video, or how Dr. Kieran O'Keefe does his training, if you've ever been on one of his online training courses. And you should be able to see the slides behind me. And there's a lovely flower bed and it says Biggleswade. If you can't see that or you have any difficulties, let me know. I can see some thumbs up, so I think it is working, which is brilliant. Right, let us kick off. So this is a proof of concept. I wanted to see if I could run a ghost walk for people who either can't make it to Biggleswade, who aren't able to do the town centre walk, or for if it's a night like this, I really don't want to be out in Biggleswade wandering around in the rain and the cold. It was fine in the summer when we had torrential rain, but it would not be fine when it's freezing cold. So this is a proof of concept to see if it works. I do have a new piece of kit, which I haven't been able to use for this walk, but I've got one of those fancy 360-degree cameras, and I'm planning to go out and walk part of the route with it so that I'll have some 360-degree images to show people when I do future versions of this. So I really hope that, I get to do that. And so that's why your feedback's really important for me today. One of the reasons, though, that I really wanted to do this virtual walk is that I can take in more places. And so we're going to start to the north of Biggleswade. In a minute, I'm going to bring up a map to show you. Oh, I can see there's a few people are saying they're not able to see what I'm sharing. If you can't see the slides, please can you let me know? So Kate says that she can't. I'm really sorry, Kate. Is there anyone else who can't currently see the slides? I know there's a few people who say they can see them. This can sometimes happen. And my first suggestion is that you log in and out. If there's anyone else who isn't able to see the slides, please let me know, because there are other ways for me to share the slides that I can try. At the moment, it looks like it's Kate only that's got the problem, but I will keep an eye on the chat. So if anybody else is having a problem, let me know. You should be able to see now a slide that says Murder Bridge. The other thing that sometimes happens that I've noticed in work meetings is sometimes the slides don't catch up and they just decide to stop. So if that happens, please also let me know, and I can just go to the boring old screen sharing and we will try that. But I'm going to start with Murder Bridge because this isn't in the town centre, so I'm not able to tell the story of Murder Bridge when I do the town centre ghost walks. And I'm just going to now show you a map of Biggleswade. So I don't believe you're able to see my pointer, which is a bit of a shame because I am. Ah, thank you. Apparently, sometimes switching to a different browser can also help if you're having difficulties seeing the slides. So there's another one for you, Kate. But I'm glad I'm recording it because I can then at least share the video with you afterwards. So we've got a map of Biggleswade here in front of us, and there is a street that is lined in yellow towards the top, the northeast of Biggleswade. And it's that bit of road that we are going to be talking about now. And this is where Murder Bridge is. But in fact, there are two bridges. There are two blue X's on this yellow road. And those two X's mark two different bridges on the Potton Road. And one of the very peculiar things about this ghost story is that the bridge that it happens at moved over time. And we'll have a look at why that was as I tell you the ghost story. The yellow lines down here that are more in the town centre, these are other places that we are going to visit. We're going to do this route, and there's some little red dots on there, really just indicating the different stops we're going to take on the walk. But we're at Murder Bridge. And this is the bridge most frequently known as Murder Bridge. And the story that is attached to this bridge, some of you may know from the podcast. And I'm going to go back in time and I'm going to start at the newest version of this story. And I'm then going to move forward, move backwards in time. But if you grew up in the Biggleswade area in the 1980s or 90s, you probably played on the common. It's not like today where children spend most of their times indoors and they go out to play, they're usually supervised. I remember the 1980s and wandering around the fields near where I lived, not too far from Biggleswade. And in the 80s and 90s, there were always children playing on the common. And one of the ghost stories they would tell would be to do not approach this bridge. This bridge was known as Murder Bridge because a nurse in the Second World War had been murdered and her body had been found under this bridge. Now, removing all jeopardy here, there is no evidence that a nurse was murdered and found under that bridge. So it's one of those stories where clearly it's just grown up over time. There's no evidence that this happened, but in a moment, I'll tell you what did happen much, much earlier. But in the 1980s, this is what the kids believed, and they would be playing out on the common and dare each other to approach Murder Bridge, where it was said that children would see a grey cloaked figure emerge from under the bridge. And this cloak was an old nurse's cloak that she was wearing. And she would rise up and scare away all the naughty children. So it was the kind of story that was used to dare each other to approach the bridge, but also to keep younger children away from the bridge. Now, most people in Biggleswade will have heard the story of Murder Bridge and heard that story growing up in the last sort of 50 years. But it's not the first ghost story associated with the bridge. We go back to 1921. Oh, and actually, before we do that, this is the same river that goes, or the stream that goes under the bridge, just north of the bridge. The other pictures I'm showing you are south of the bridge. And it's just to give you an idea. You know, you can see why kids wanted to play here in the 1980s. It's shallow. You could get down to it in certain places with your buckets and your fishing nets. It was like a really cool place to hang out. Nowadays, you know, it would be a health and safety nightmare. But back then, kids were quite happily playing here. But we've now got the bridge in black and white because we're going back to 1921. And the first ghost story that is recorded associated with this bridge happens in 1921. And I think, you know, that straight away dispels this whole thing about a nurse from the 1940s. And in 1921, the story comes about because it's reported in the board minutes, as in the hospital board. They weren't bored in the meeting. The hospital board minutes of a meeting that was held at Christmas time. In fact, it was held just before Christmas. I think it was the 23rd of December. And it's then published in the newspaper on Boxing Day. Really exciting stuff. But within the board meeting, where they're talking about Christmas meals for the patients and who's going to work what shifts, they also tell this ghost story. And it had happened earlier that month. So this time of year, very early December, and a group of cyclists had been out. They were young men who'd returned from the First World War, and they were doing a lot of cycling for their mental and physical health. And there was about half a dozen of them, this little group that would go out cycling on a Sunday afternoon. And they'd cycled all the way to Cockayne Hatley, to Gamlingay, and then these are little villages around Biggleswade. And then they had come back via Potton and Sutton and were cycling back into Biggleswade, approaching this bridge on the Potton Road. And as they were cycling towards it, they were just thinking about getting home before it got dark. So it was dusk time, but it wasn't dark. Now, at the head of the cyclists, and I think, is it a peloton cyclists cycling? Well, at the head was Tom, and he was a little bit further ahead than the other men. And as he's cycling towards the bridge, he sees a strange grey hunched shape in the road. And he's really worried that it's a sack or something, like a sack of potatoes or just something that's been left there. And then the next thing he sees is this, what he thinks is a sack of potatoes suddenly rears up in front of him. And it's a grey cloaked figure. And it terrifies him. He's scared he's going to crash into it. So he swerves his bike and he crashes into the side of the bridge around here at the top. His friends behind him, those at the front, also see this grey figure. And they also are absolutely shocked by it, but they're then really worried about poor old Tom because he's come off his bike. Those that were at the end of the group, they don't really see this grey figure, but they do see Tom come off his bike. So they all gather around Tom. They check that he's okay. Those that saw the strange grey figure are obviously really shaken up. And so they do that thing that all I think British men and women would do in such a circumstance of having seen what, a cloaked figure, somebody being injured on a bike. They go to the pub and they go to the Checkers Inn on the Potton Road, which was opposite the um, hospital. It's the Checkers pub no longer exists, but the building is still there. It's a private home. So they go into the pub, and initially, Tom starts telling this story about what he saw, and the rest of the group that weren't so sure that they'd seen a ghost were getting really worried. It was like, Tom, shut up, stop telling this story. The landlord's going to laugh at us. But the landlord didn't laugh at them because he said that at least two other people in the last week had seen this grey, cloaked or shrouded figure appear out of nowhere and terrify them. And in fact, if we go back to the hospital board meeting, which is where we originally heard this story, where it's written up in the newspapers, the guy telling the story is a Mr. Chandler, and he was a solicitor. And at this point, he's actually quite elderly, and he has been in Biggleswade for all his life, lived in Biggleswade all his life. And he says to the people gathered at this hospital meeting, I think I know what this ghost is about. I think I know who it is. And he then tells them a very strange story. And the story is about a gentleman that he remembers from Biggleswade, but who had died about 13 years before this ghost sighting. And this chap is known as John Francis Hunt. And he is a medium or spiritualist, or he was a medium or spiritualist. And he believed that the spirits were telling him about a murderer who was on the loose. There had been between 1850 and 1870s a number of accidental or strange deaths around the Potton Road, both coming out and into Biggleswade, where we just were at Murder Bridge, but also further afield. There's a Potton Road that leads to Gamblingay as well. And he got himself into a lot of trouble telling these stories about saying that the spirits were telling him that people had been murdered. He got himself into so much trouble, there was a libel case because he accused two men of Gamblingay of being the murderers. But the first death, suspicious death, that aroused his suspicion was from 1850, and it was of a young woman named Eliza Lawson. And in 1857, Eliza Lawson, she was only 17. Her body was found under a bridge on the Potton Road, but it wasn't the bridge that I just showed you. It wasn't that murder bridge. It was the one that was slightly further away, which is known as Millbrook Bridge. Again, I'm showing you a picture here of what the stream is like. So in some places, the stream is very shallow like this, and you can get down to the river easily. And back in the 19th century, there were quite often a lot of watercress growing down there, and people would be harvesting the watercress. And it seems that that was what Eliza was doing. After work, she was on her way home, she was collecting watercress. She slipped, had an accident, obviously couldn't get back up and drowned. So it's really tragic. However, many people at the time just wouldn't believe that that could possibly have happened to a young, fit and healthy girl. Why didn't she get up? Why didn't she come back out of the stream? Now, it is possible to drown in very shallow water. So I think it is most likely that she did just accidentally drown. There was an inquest. They did look into this. But for some reason, John Francis Hunt was convinced that she had been murdered. Now, he didn't even live in Biggleswade when this happened. He just heard about it afterwards. So it's really strange that he fixated on this particular case. But our Mr. Chandler at the hospital meeting decides that this is who the ghost is. Now, he doesn't remember Eliza's name. He just remembers that John Francis Hunt said that a girl had been murdered. And that's where our ghost story, I think, begins. Now, just before we leave the common, I just wanted to show you this picture. On the other side of all this overgrown stuff here is that bridge, the picture that I showed you before in black and white and colour. It's hidden behind here. There's the lamppost and the road's the other side. Now, obviously, I don't think in Victorian times it would have been quite so overgrown, but I think it shows you that in the height of summer, around the common, the vegetation does grow very high. And I could imagine how a poor girl could maybe fall into the river, into the stream, and not be able to get back up or find it incredibly difficult to get out, and also find it incredibly difficult other people to actually find her and see her. So it's a really sad story, but it's amazing how long that story has lasted, and also how the bridge moved. The original bridge was nearer to Sutton, but the bridge that everyone remembers was much nearer to town. But I think I know what that grey, cloaked or shrouded figure was that people were seeing, and it wasn't poor Eliza's ghost. It was a heron. And I'm telling you this because I got terrified by a heron a couple of years ago. So where I live in Biggleswade, we've also got a very similar stream that runs alongside one of the main roads. And I was walking along that road about 8 o'clock at night on my way to the supermarket. And it was dark because it was winter time. And suddenly, from nowhere, in front of me was this huge, shrieking grey figure. And it was kind of cloaked with this long neck, and it had dangling legs, and it was just floating in front of me and shrieking. And I was terrified. It felt like seconds, but it was probably a split second. And it suddenly started flapping its wings and it flew off. And I realized it was our local heron that lives on that stream. So I'm wondering if in the 1920s, these cyclists and the people going to work at the hospital that said they saw this grey cloaked figure were in fact seeing a heron. So that's my theory about Murder Bridge. But we're going to head into town now. We're going to leave the common, and there's some beautiful paths like this around the edges of the common where there's actual trees and it's not just the sort of scrubby wasteland that the common is. Lots of cows do graze on the common still, so it is still used. And we're going to head into town via Drove Road. Now, Drove Road is a old Roman road, and that's because many of you will probably know that the A1 or the Great North Road runs through and around Biggleswade. So what I wanted, well, one of the things that, sorry, I'm just scrolling through my notes here. So yes, Drove Road. It was used for centuries, probably even before the Romans got here, as an ancient path leading down from the common land and from where you would have had cattle and sheep grazing into Biggleswade to be either taken to markets or to be sold. And I say even before the Roman times, obviously there wasn't a Biggleswade then, but we know there was a lot of Bronze Age and Iron Age settlements in this area. And we know that when the Romans got here, there were already people settled, and they adopted some of the routes that those people used. And they even built a temple near to Biggleswade, just north of Biggleswade, not far from Murder Bridge. So the Romans were using this road, and it's now called Drove Road. And because people would have been driving the sheep and the cattle into Biggleswade or off the common in the winter to be closer to where people were living. But the ghost story around Drove Road is one where I have never met anybody that says this has happened to them, but it's one of those stories that, again, people in Biggleswade will hear. If you're walking along Drove Road late at night, or if you happen to be someone who lives along Drove Road, quite often in winter, very late at night, you will hear marching feet. And not just a few people marching, but many, many people marching. And it is said that if you are brave enough to stay on Drove Road to see who's coming, or you look out of your window, if you live on Drove Road, what you will see is an ancient Roman army, or a ghostly version of them, marching along Drove Road, heading away from Biggleswade. Now, like I say, I've not met anybody that has seen this ghostly army, but it's a fun little story about Drove Road. And it is true that it is probably a Roman road and has, been used for centuries. But I'm going to take you now to Crab Lane Gardens. Now, Crab Lane Gardens no longer exists, sadly, but this is where it was. Behind my head, but you'll get another a view of it in a minute. If I move like that, behind my head is the library. And here we have the chestnut trees, which are probably all that remains of Crab Lane Gardens. Um, the Crab Lane Gardens were certainly there in the 19th century, but I don't know when they were originally built. This is what Crab Lane looks like again. I'm going to have to move my head. Actually, which way should I move? I'll move that way. Crab Lane is not at all impressive. It now currently is, you can only drive down it one way and you can't get out at the end of Crab Lane. Um, the buildings at the side here are old schoolrooms, and we'll come on to those in the next story that I tell you. But Crab Lane really doesn't look very impressive. And yet, if we go back to the 19th century, it was one of the main routes north out of Biggleswade, and the gardens were built to the east of Crab Lane. And obviously, that's why they got to be called the Crab Lane Gardens. If we go further up Crab Lane, you get more of an idea that, there's lots of trees. It still is quite a nice green place. But they've built, since the 1950s, they've built the library there. There's an ambulance station. There's a fire station, and there's now a very new medical centre. But if we go back to before 1950, it was still the gardens. They developed all of this after the war. So when it was the gardens, they were the kind of places, it was the kind of place that people liked to stroll in, take some exercise, that typical kind of Victorian genteel gardens. I wish we still had them. But our ghost story happens in the gardens at this end of the gardens, where the chestnut trees are today, where the library is just on the left there. And we know that because these ghost stories were reported in the local newspaper, the Biggleswade Chronicle. And in 1880, the first encounter with something ghostly happened. And it was a young man walking home from the pub late at night. And he said that he saw some ghostly lights flickering and moving amongst the trees in the gardens. Now, nobody believed him because he was on his way home from the pub and they just assumed he'd had a skinful. But he wasn't the only person to see these ghosts. More and more people began to see these ghostly lights, and not all of them were drunk. It took a painter and decorator who had signed the pledge and was a leading Methodist in the town to also see the lights for him to be taken seriously. And he described the light as being like a rugby ball shape, that it was definitely not a candle. It was definitely not a lantern. It wasn't a newfangled electric light. It wasn't a torch. He could not, say that it was something he had never seen before in real life. And he said it shifted in shape, although it was like rugby ball shaped, it would move in and out of its size, it would get bigger and smaller, and it would flit about in a way that he just could not imagine would be humanly possible to move a light around. And people began to believe him. And so throughout the 1880s, more and more people were seeing the lights, and it became the kind of place where children would be scared to go into, but also would dare each other to go into the gardens to see the ghostly lights. Meanwhile, many women would refuse to walk past there apparently at night by themselves and would want to be accompanied. But things really took a turn in 1888 when people started to report seeing a very Victorian looking ghost. And here's an image, I think this is from Hammersmith, where a similar ghost was seen. And it was described as being white and sheet-like, and that it had a kind of canopy over its head, the classic white ghost or sheet ghost that we think of today. But this, for the time, was seen as this is what ghosts look like. And this is partly down to the mediums and the spiritualists of the day, and sadly, the fake mediums. And there were many fake mediums in the 19th century, sadly. And what they would do is they would quite often use luminescent paint and substances to make objects glow. And in the very dark seance rooms, have somebody dressed in black, wearing black gloves and their faces covered, moving these objects around. So the idea of glowing lights were associated with ghosts because of this, but also um, the idea of these sort of sheet-like visages of ghosts was definitely a Victorian thing. And this is what they start to see. They also start to hear the ghost making a noise for the first time. And that's summer of 1888. They start hearing this very sort of falsetto wailing. Woo! Woo! And it terrifies those that see it. And we now get into a situation where Biggleswade is really, really scared. We've got young men refusing to walk past the gardens and taking long diversions in order to avoid them and being late for work. And you've also got some local businesses like the Wheatsheaf pub who are losing customers because they're scared of the gardens. So it takes the landlord from the Wheatsheaf pub to decide that he is going to lay this ghost. And this is a very Victorian concept that you could basically take a Bible, a hymn book, a group of people could go to a haunted place and basically wait for the ghost. When it appeared, they would sing and pray, and the ghost would go. It's a bit like an exorcism, but you don't need a vicar there or a priest. So this is what they decide to try. And laying a ghost always works better if you have with you a respectable professional person. So they invite along a couple of solicitors. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if I would not be surprised if some of the people who were that one of the solicitors there was Mr. Chandler, who was at that board meeting in 1921, because he had been uh, a solicitor in Biggleswade for a very long time, and at that board meeting is very old. Just want to welcome those of you that have just come in. I'm so sorry that I was late in admitting you. We are recording it, so I'll make sure you get a recording. And you've only missed the first real big ghost story. There are still plenty of ghost stories to come. We are going to have a break. And again, I'm really, really sorry that you were late being admitted. So we're just at the end of this ghost story. So the solicitors, the landlord from the pub, and a group of drinkers from the pub all decide to go and lay this ghost. And they spend the night crouched in the bushes in the Crab Lane Gardens in Biggleswade, just waiting for this ghost to appear. And for the first few hours, they're really just bored and uncomfortable. But then it turns that they begin to decide that really it's not going to show. Maybe we should just read some prayers and sing some hymns and go. And just as they're at that point where they're beginning to give up, they hear that wailing noise, that falsetto ooh noise. And at that point, the two solicitors are flat down on their bellies on the ground, terrified. The drinkers from the pub and the landlord keep watching. They keep watching and waiting for whatever's making this noise to appear. And then this white, ghostly sheet kind of hovers into view. And at this point, the two drinkers from the pub are also scared and they crouch down and are terrified. But the landlord is not afraid. The landlord of the Wheatsheaf notices that underneath these flowing white sheets, there are some hobnail boots. And he thinks, I don't think a ghost wears hobnail boots. So he goes running towards the ghost. He rugby tackles it to the ground. The ghost does not disappear. Instead, he has his arms around a human and he falls to the floor with him. They unmask him by ripping off the sheet in the best Scooby-Doo style before Scooby-Doo was even a thing. And at that point, they unmask a young man named Sam, who was a butler. It's also said in the newspaper reports that Sam the butler was also part of the amateur dramatics group and quite often played the pantomime dame because he was very good at putting on a falsetto voice. So that is the story of the Crab Lane Gardens ghost. But that is not the end of the story, because although Sam was caught and unmasked, he said, I've only been dressing as a ghost and making this silly noise for the last few weeks. I've got nothing to do with the lights that have been seen there for the last decade. And even after Sam was captured, the lights around the Crab Lane Gardens area was still seen. Now, obviously, the Crab Lane Gardens no longer exist, but when one of the chestnut trees outside the library became diseased and had to be chopped down, they turned the stump into a little fairy stump. And it's the same stump here. There's only one stump, and I've got two pictures of it. In the autumn, the sort of bracket fungi grows out of it as well, and they incorporate that into the um, little fairy glen that they've got there. And the kids love it. But I also wonder if perhaps these lights that were seen were not necessarily ghosts, but maybe they were something a bit more fey, a bit more fairy-like. And in fact, one of the businesses that is just behind the library has told me that they believe they have a helpful spirit or energy that's with them in that business, because quite often they will find things have been tidied up when they've left them in a mess, or they will find items that were lost will suddenly reappear. So they really do believe that there might be fairies or something similar lurking in that area. Just a thought. So, our final ghost story for this half is about the ghost shop. And the postcard here behind me shows a building that still exists in Biggleswade. I'll show you a modern image of it in a moment. But at this point, in 1907, when this postcard was sent, this was a school and it was known as Camden House School. And this is where our ghost story is set, but not when it was the school. So here's the same postcard, but just from a slightly different angle and in black and white. So the history of this building is quite interesting. It was Camden House School, and it was a girls' school at first. The girls' school was one of those kind of middle class girls' schools where the young ladies that attended would be taught English and maths, but also French, music, singing. Art, the kind of things that were seen as important for a young middle class lady's education. And there were boarders at the school as well as day girls. But as the 19th century wore on and we started to get universal education, some schoolrooms were built towards the back of the school. And I showed you some images before. These are two of the schoolrooms. There's another one in front of it. So they had three long schoolrooms that were built behind it. But as I said, our story isn't actually about Camden House when it was a school, although it may be important. So from the 1930s onwards, the school had closed and some shops had opened in the building instead. And we know for a fact there was a furniture shop there and also a newsagents. And our story happens in the newsagents. And we think it was this part of the building on this side. Sorry, I'm forgetting you can't see my cursor. So the side nearest to my head, the right-hand side of the building. That is where we think that the newsagents was. And this ghost story was so well known by 1970 that when the newsagents closed, the headline in the local newspaper was "Ghost Shop Closes." Now, one of the things that I just want to show you before I tell you the ghost story is just how close to the sorry, gone the wrong way. Just how close the lamppost is to the building. So although this is a modern lamppost, we know that there was being a lamppost on this site since 1880. The 1881 Ordnance Survey maps definitely show that there's a lamppost there. And the reason I'm saying this is important is that what happened in the newsagents happened at night. And it's important to know that there was some light filtering into the bedroom. Now, oh, have we still got people having issues with the PowerPoint? I am so sorry, Katie. I'm really, really sorry. Um, I really don't know what else to suggest. I really don't. Other than I'm guessing it might, yeah, like you say, it might just be something to do with your settings. I will definitely send you the video as soon as we finish tonight so that you can have a look at the video. I am so, so sorry. And I'll look into it to see if there's anything I can do in the future. So let's get back to the ghost story. In the newsagents, we've got a couple called Bill and Ivy. I've given them their names because the newspaper articles about them doesn't tell you their names. But I've called them Bill and Ivy, and it's at night. They're in the bedroom. Remember, it's not pitch dark in that bedroom because this lamppost is outside and it does filter some light through the curtains. Ivy wakes up all of a sudden and she knows that she's been woken by something. You know, we've all experienced it, maybe a noise or some movement, and she's awake and really alert. And as she sort of opens her eyes and kind of looks around and wonders what's going on, she sees a shadow at the end of the bed. And her first thought is that it's Bill, her husband. So she says, Bill, what are you doing, love? Why have you got up? But as she says that, she feels Bill stir at her side. And she realizes that the shadow at the end of the bed is not her husband. So she is suddenly terrified. Her heart is racing. She's convinced there is an intruder at the bottom of her bed, standing there in the light that's coming through the curtains. She grabs hold of Bill and she's holding onto his arm and she's, Bill, wake up, Bill, wake up. But as she's doing this and he's coming round, she suddenly realizes that the thing she is looking at is not solid. This is just a shadow. It's darker than the darkest parts of the corners of the room, but she can't work out what on earth is casting it because there's nothing that can be casting that shadow unless it is floating outside the window. And that she is sure it is not. It's there at the end of the bed in the room with her. And as Bill blearily comes round, the actual shadow suddenly begins to rub itself out. And she said it was almost like it had a chalky edge, and that chalky edge is then kind of rubbed away and the shadow goes. Now, I don't know what happened after she saw that shadow at the bottom of her bed, whether they continued to run that newsagents. But what I do know is that during the next 10 years, more and more things were heard, in particular in that building. The furniture shop owner, a man who was known as Mr. Boniface, he reported hearing footsteps running up and down the stairs in that building, about doors slamming, of people feeling as if someone had just walked into the room next to them and they looked over their shoulder to see who it was, and there is no one there. So the building became really well known for ghost stories. But it seems that these stories were forgotten. They were completely forgotten until I've discovered them again in the newspapers. And at that point, I went around asking, and most people that had worked there or lived there were like, I've never heard of any ghost stories. But funny you should say that. And the people that have worked there in the past have said to me that it never really felt like they were completely alone in that building. And then a couple of people who live in the flats above have told me that they too hear the footsteps running up and down the stairs, and they sound like children's feet running up and down the stairs. And so it made me think about schools and that atmosphere that you get in schools. And we're going to go and have our break now. But while we're on the break, have a think about it, because I know all of us have been to school. We've all experienced being in school. And yet we also know what it's like, most of us, to walk into a school when it's empty and how strange that feels. It's almost as if you can sense the absence of the children that should be there. And it's the same when you go into an empty theatre or any kind of building, an empty sports stadium, an empty police station, an empty supermarket, places that are normally full of life and energy. When we are in them and they're empty and still, it's almost as if you can still sense who was there before us. Now, this could be a psychological thing or it could be a spiritual thing. I don't know. But I just think it's interesting that that building used to be a school. And a lot of the haunting experiences seem to relate to the idea of children running around in there. Now, we are going to have a break. It is 45 minutes, like I said. So it's 7:45 now. If people can be back here at 5 to, that would be amazing. So at 7:55, and we will start again. Um, I'm gonna do something now that might actually not work, or it might work, just to see if we can get the slides working for the people that haven't been able to see the slides. I'm actually going to come out of the slides and I'll try and go back into them when we start at after our little break. So let's see if this works. Yes, it looks like it does. It looks like it's just all us again. So I'm going to go and grab myself a drink. I will be back. If anybody's got any questions or they want to have a chat, please do come and have a chat to me. When I put my camera back on, you'll know that I'm back here. And thank you so much to all of you for listening so far. And I'll catch up with the chat as well and answer some questions if there's any in there. Oh, so that worked. And share. Of course, it's taking me back to the beginning. And there it is saying, let's take a break. So let's see if that helps. It may make things worse. I don't know. It might mean that more of you lose the slides. So if any of you have now lost that slide background as you come back, please let me know. And if anybody has got any questions, then please do ask. I'm on mute. I'm sitting here chatting away to myself and I'm on mute. Thank you for telling me. We are going to start back now in a moment. But what I have done is for those of you that are having difficulty seeing the slides, and I should have thought of this from straight away, I have put the slides in the chat. So the document is in the chat and hopefully you can download it. And so you could look at the slides alongside the Zoom call if that makes it easier for you. I am so sorry I didn't think of that from right at the start. What I will do, and this is, like I said, it's the first time I've done it, so it's a learning curve. What I will do in future is probably send the slides out to everyone in advance when I do the email that just reminds you that the talk's coming up, just in case we have this situation, and then you can go through the slides at your own pace. So thank you, everybody. I hope you've all had a cup of tea or you've managed to get yourself a mulled wine. And we're now going to go into the town centre. So we're going to take the bridge. In the photograph here, we've got the bridge going into the town centre. This is along the high street. The building that is kind of in the centre of this image used to be the magistrates' court, but it's now a private home. And we're gonna go over the bridge into town, and our first stop is going to be at the Big Theatre. Now, the Big Theatre wasn't always a theatre. In fact, it's only very recently been a theatre. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the building. But first of all, I just wanted to draw your attention to this lovely Edwardian water fountain that's outside it. But the Big Theatre was built as a town hall, which you might guess from seeing the columns here outside. Uh, and from the very moment that it was built as a town hall, it has also been an entertainment venue. So here's an image of uh, the water fountain outside with the light on it, and the Big Theatre at night. It is a great name, isn't it? Big Theatre, BIGG. Um, so the Big Theatre was originally the town hall. It was built in 1846. After it was built, it was straight away was being used as a theatre, as well as obviously hosting town hall meetings, magistrates meetings, the kind of things you would expect. But also there were stars, the celebrities of their day coming up from London, West End music hall stars, singers, actors were coming up to perform because when the railway arrived in Biggleswade in 1850, it meant that they could get up from London and do a performance in Biggleswade and get home really easily. Still would take them a whole, that was a day's journey kind of to do that whole thing. Come up in the morning, perform in the afternoon, go home on the sort of last train back down to London. It wasn't fast. It wasn't taking them half an hour like it does today or 40 minutes to get to London. But it stopped being the town hall and the performance venue in about 1920 when a new town hall was built nearer to the station. And it then became a petrol station, which is quite interesting. And but for most of the 20th century, from the 1930s right up until the 1990s, it was Gale's electrical goods shop. And it was the kind of place where you would go in to buy a television, you would buy a fridge, you could buy any electrical goods, but it also sold bikes and toys. So a lot of kids remember Gale's very fondly. But in the 1990s, it became a Pizza Express. So it's had a very varied time as a building. And then about 6 years ago, it became the Big Theatre. Now, this is what it looks like inside. This was Owen Staten, the Welsh storyteller, and I at the beginning of November doing our live show in the theatre. And I wanted to point out to you there's a little alcove that you can see we're sitting in on the left, and on the right, you can kind of see the alcove there with the sort of star blanket, I forgot what they call them, hanging behind it. Now that alcove is listed. It can't be changed. It was there originally, and I can imagine the magistrate sitting in that alcove or the mayor at a town meeting up on a stage. So it's a lovely building inside. Oh no, Kate. So you can see it, but you have to make it tiny. Well, I hope you can get hold of the slides. I really do that are in the that are in the chat above. And if not, like I said, I'm going to send you the video. Um, the one reason I showed you this and the alcove and talked about the magistrates is one really interesting thing about the building is that underneath the theatre there is a prison cell because the magistrates obviously were hearing court cases and they needed a prison cell. Unfortunately, we can't get into that prison cell because it's in the basement and they've concreted over the entrance. And it does make you wonder why. Why did they have to concrete over the entrance to the basement and the prison cell? But I don't think we will ever find out. But our ghost story does not involve the prison cell. So they say that every theatre has a ghost, and the big theatre certainly seems to be no exception. Except this ghost doesn't necessarily start when the theatre arrived. It seems to be much older. And the Pizza Express staff were the ones who told me the ghost story. In fact, it was one of the cleaners who used to work there. But it turns out that not only the cleaners, but also bar staff and the staff who worked in the kitchen and the waiters and waitresses also experienced this ghost. And she's described as being a chatty lady. And what would happen is the cleaners would be in early in the morning, cleaning up, ready for the day to start. They might be the first people in there. There was no one else around. But then they would hear this lady chatting, and her voice was described as an older lady, and it was a one-way conversation. They could never hear anybody responding to her. And so the first few times they heard this chatty lady, they assumed it was a customer or a member of staff that had arrived. They'd go through to see who it was, and there would be no one there. So she kind of got a reputation because so many staff heard this chatty lady that she was just known as the chatty ghost. And she was also seen as helpful. So you can imagine people leave their glasses or a scarf or even like their wallet behind in a Pizza Express in a restaurant. And they would quite often phone up the next morning and say, did I leave my glasses here or my keys? And the cleaners would be asked, and they'd be like, well, no, we've not found anything. A few hours later, suddenly, bold as brass would appear on a table that had been already checked, whatever it was that was lost, the pair of glasses, the keys, the wallet. And so it was seen that this chatty ghost was very good at finding things and handing them back in. But what I found really, really fascinating was I was told that story. And at the time, I don't think anyone else who worked at the big theatre knew about the Pizza Express ghost. Oh, sorry, I've gone backwards. So I popped into the theatre around this time last year to interview Anna, one of the directors there, about her experience working in theatres and about theatre ghosts. And so I asked her if she had any ghostly stories about the big theatre, and she said no. It is really just a lovely venue with a beautiful atmosphere, and I can totally agree with that. Um, and so I after she told me that, she went away and she asked the staff, though, just in case they had experienced anything. And she came back to me and said, well, actually, the girls who work in the bar, they say that they think there is a ghost and they've both heard her. And at this point, my blood ran cold because I'm like, I know what she's going to say. And they said they've heard an older lady just chatting. And they'll be in the bar and it seems like it's coming from the theatre. So they go back into the theatre to see if somebody's wandered in. And in fact, there's no one there. And then the same thing will happen that they'll be tidying up in the theatre after a performance once everyone is gone and the bar at the front is locked up. But they'll hear this older lady's voice chatting coming from the bar. So it seems that a very friendly and helpful, chatty older lady is haunting the big theatre. And yes, haunted pizza does sound like a brilliant thing. So I'm just reading the chat. But I've got to be quick because I don't want to overrun. I think in the future I'm going to have to make these 2 hours with a 10-minute break. But we're hopefully going to get through all the stories. I'm going to take you to the Golden Pheasant now. And I love the Golden Pheasant. It's my local. And this is the pub. The photograph was taken through the window of the theatre opposite. And that's why there's raindrops on part of the image and a light reflected. So the pub is opposite the theatre, and this image is straight. It's the pub that's crooked. So it is a lovely pub, but it's very crooked, and part of it seems to be sinking into the cellar below. Now there are many ghost stories associated with this pub, and here's an image of me in the pub that was taken by a professional photographer for an organization I was giving a talk to, and the photographer turned the guys in the pub into ghosts. So we've got Carl the barman, Paddy the landlord is there in the picture as well as some of the regulars. So the ghost stories associated with this pub, there are many. There is a headless ghost, there is a singing ghost, and there is also Morris, the 1930s landlord who was supposed to haunt the building. But I'm not going to tell you those stories today. They're on the podcast and you can hear those. So instead, I am going to tell you about something else that happened there. And it happened to one of the landlord's friends, James, and it happened in the very late 90s, early noughties. So Paddy, the landlord, had a group of friends from Shefford, and his parents had just taken over the pub. So Paddy's a young man at this point. He's in his early 20s. And him and his friends are deciding that they're going to go out for a night out around Biggleswade and they're going to crash at the pub overnight. Now, the pub was not open at this point to the public. His mum and dad, Paddy's mum and dad, had just taken it over. They're doing it up, getting it ready to open. So upstairs in the flat, it's completely empty. So him and his friends, and this happened to his friend James, I'm going to call him. That's not his actual name, but he's told me this story. So James and his mates, there's about 6 or 7 of them, along with Paddy, go out for a night around Biggleswade. They have a bit to drink, and then they come back and they crash upstairs in the Pheasant. Now, it's that kind of sleeping on coats set up, sleeping in a sleeping bag if you were clever, bright enough to bring one with you. And James was. So James had brought a sleeping bag with him. Now, he woke in the night at about 4 o'clock. And again, it was one of those things where he knew what had woken him up, and it wasn't anything scary. It was his mate next to him snoring. And he said he knows he was fully awake because he'd been lying there watching his friend drooling and snoring and thinking, oh, mate, you just look rubbish. And he was also getting quite annoyed because he wanted to go back to sleep, but he just couldn't get back to sleep with the noise of the snoring. So he thought, I know, I'll go and get a glass of water. So he rolled over in his sleeping bag. And as he did, he caught glimpse something or someone sitting at the end of his sleeping bag. And it was a little girl. He says she was wearing a grey, like smock, and she was sitting down and hugging her knees. You know, that kind of how little children quite often sit. And she was just staring at him as if to say, who are you? And he wasn't afraid because he thought it was a real girl. He was like, how the hell has a little girl got in here? There was no one living there at that point, and he was just concerned for this little girl. So as he sat up and he sort of looked at her and he's about to say to her, are you okay? Where are your parents? She disappeared. And that was what scared him. Now, he did manage to get back to sleep, he said, eventually. And in the morning, he told Paddy and his friends that he'd seen this little girl and that she'd disappeared and that he was convinced it was a ghost. But Paddy and his friends just laughed at him and said he's daft. There's no such things as ghosts, stop being so daft. And James says he actually got quite upset about it because he knew what he saw. And a few weeks later, once the pub had opened and Paddy's parents were working in there and they were putting on Sunday lunches at that point. Sadly, they don't do Sunday lunches anymore. But Paddy's parents were making Sunday lunch and he was in there drinking with his friends and Paddy. And James said they all heard an almighty crash come from the kitchen. It sounded like every pot and pan in that kitchen, every roasting tin had been thrown to the ground. So they ran into the kitchen to check that Paddy's dad was all right, who was in there doing the cooking. And he's just looking at them bewildered. He's like, what do you mean? Everything's fine. And yet everyone in the pub had heard it. So, they all just kind of shrug and say, well, that was weird. But James stayed behind and he starts talking to Paddy's dad and he says, I saw something really strange here. And before he could finish what he was saying, Paddy's dad said to him, ah, you know about the ghost. And it turned out that Paddy's dad had noticed various things happening. For example, he had gone to put some Yorkshire puddings in the oven. He'd put the batter in the containers down on the side, gone to open the oven, went back to where he'd placed them, and they'd moved. They were at the complete opposite end of the kitchen. But he had also seen a little girl running up the stairs. So James felt vindicated. Now, Paddy still lives in that pub. He is now the landlord. He still doesn't believe in ghosts. He still doesn't believe that the pub is haunted, but he's very happy for me to tell the stories and to share them and to get a lot of publicity for the pub, which I'm very happy to do. So we're going to take a walk through the town centre. This is through the market square. You might recognise the building here, which is over my head, as the Market House building that's in the Wade artwork. And we're going to go to somewhere really just the other side of the market square. And I'm going to very quickly tell you about one of the ghosts that haunts the Conservative Club. Now, you could make quite a few jokes nowadays about the Conservatives and ghosts, but I am not going to be political at all. So, this building was a private home before it was the Conservative Club. It dates back to probably the 17th century. The building that's there is mainly 18th century with some 19th and 20th century additions. But it's been the Conservative and Commonwealth Club, I believe, was its original title, since the early 20th century. And this story is about Biggleswade's brass band. Now, Biggleswade's brass band, and this is a picture of them from 1950, were an award-winning brass band. Sadly, we no longer have a brass band, but they were quite famous in the area for being a really good brass band. And they used to practice at the Conservative Club. They hired a room, and in the 1930s, they would practice there. Now, in 1937, this story happens, and it happens to a man named George. And I believe this man on the far left is George because he's playing a trombone, and he looks old enough that he would have been playing the trombone 13 years beforehand. I know he is in this photograph. So, George, the trombone player, he's very diligent. He likes to get there early, at least half an hour to 45 minutes early before practice, before everyone else, so that he can get some practice in. And this is partly because where he lives, his neighbours are not keen on him playing the trombone. So it's a normal day. It's 1937. He's coming to his band practice as usual. He arrives at the con club, goes in, takes his coat and hat off, and he turns around to go up what would have been the servants' stairs to the back room where they practice. But as he sets foot onto those stairs, he suddenly senses that something's not right. And then in front of him materializes out of nowhere a Cavalier soldier. And the Cavalier is dressed in silks and has a lacy collar and a flamboyant hat. And he also has a sword. But luckily at this point, the sword is sheathed. Now, because he's appeared out of nowhere, George is already startled. He's convinced this isn't someone that's just run down the stairs towards him. And in fact, that's something else that's very odd about this encounter. There is no sound. And yet, George sees that the Cavalier's face is red and his mouth is moving like he is shouting, screaming a warning, maybe. George is completely frozen. His fear response is to freeze. And he stands there gawping. And then the Cavalier takes a step towards him. He unsheaths his sword, and it's like a rapier type sword, and he starts thrusting it. And at that point, suddenly, the fear response in George turns to flight. He runs down the stairs, he grabs his coat but leaves behind his hat, and he runs home. Now, later that day, after the rehearsal that George obviously didn't make, Fred, the band leader, goes round to see George and talks to him about what happened and brings him back his hat. And George basically says, I've seen it. It's a ghost. I am terrified. I do not want to go to the Conservative Club again by myself. And he didn't. They went back and practiced a couple of times, but George would always go with someone else. And in the end, they moved their practicing place to somewhere near the Baptist church rather than practicing at the Conservative Club because George was so frightened. Now, unfortunately, the back stairs where this Cavalier soldier was seen no longer exist. But here are some creepy, scary stairs from the Conservative Club that actually would have led to the servant stairs. These are the cellar stairs, and currently they lead to nowhere because the doorway from the cellar into the main building no longer exists in that location. It's being moved. But back in the day, these cellar stairs would have led back up into the sort of servants' hall, and then they would have gone up to where the Cavalier was seen. And the reason why the stairs no longer exist, the Cavalier's stairs, let's call them, is because there was a fire in the 1950s at the Conservative Club and they remodeled the back of the building. Now, people who have worked in the Conservative Club have told me in the bar that there are still strange things that happen there, and certainly it was very creepy when I went down into the cellar. But I'm going to take you now to somewhere equally glamorous. We're going to go to Aldi, and I have a very short but sweet ghost story to tell you about Aldi. I'm really conscious of time because I've overrun already slightly, so I'm going to tell you this story very, very quickly because I want to make sure we do have a little bit of time for any questions and answers at the end. So, Aldi, it's a really short and sweet story, but it does link to the next story that I'm going to tell you and a possible cause for why Aldi might be haunted. So, it's a very modern building. We've got a post office also in the same building. The Aldi warehouses go back quite far, and there's a bit where the vehicles will drive in right at the end as well. So it's a really big kind of site, really. And the story goes like this, and it's very, very recent. Thank you for saying you liked that story a lot. I do like the Cavalier Ghost. So this story, very simple. A lady who works there currently at Aldi has said she's quite often in very early before most staff and certainly before customers get in. She'll quite often be stacking the shelves. And as she's stacking the shelves, she will hear the sound of a trolley just trundling past. And the first few times she heard it, it obviously surprised her because there's no one there. Why is the trolley moving? She'd turn around and there was no trolley moving. Yet she clearly heard it. She said it will also happen when she's out in the stock room, that she'll hear a trolley moving out in the shop. She'll go out to see if anybody's there, and there is no one there. So she is convinced that they have a ghost who is pushing a ghostly trolley also around the shop, maybe going to have a look at what's on the middle aisle, going to get themselves a bargain. So I'm afraid that's all I have to tell you about the Aldi ghost, is that it's a ghostly shopping trolley that trundles around the shop. But I promise you, it links to our next story. And our next story is about the haunted telephone exchange. So this is the telephone exchange in Biggleswade. It was built in 1969, replacing a much older one. And when it opened in 1969, it would have been a very busy and bustling place. Before I tell you about that, though, right at the far left of the image, you might be able to see a kind of tan building. That's Aldi. Aldi is directly behind the telephone exchange. And in a minute, I'm going to bring up a map and I'll describe to you what's on that map. So, telephone exchange, previously very loud and bustling, the kind of place where back in the day you had operators connecting people's calls, telephonists with lots of calls coming through. But obviously things have changed. And since the 1990s, we haven't really had operators in the same way. And many staff that worked at BT in the telephone exchange were made redundant. And this story took place in the mid-noughties, just at that point where lots of staff were leaving. Now, the telephone exchange is still, people still work in there. We still need it for people that have landlines. We still use it for internet infrastructure. But when this was happening, there were a lot fewer people working in the telephone exchange. And this happened to a young man. Now, he would quite often be there working at strange times of the day and night, and would quite often be in there by himself. And he really didn't like being called out late at night to go and fix something there because he really felt uncomfortable. First of all, he says it started with that feeling that someone was watching him, that sense of presence. But then it would become something far more kind of tangible, he would hear footsteps and he would also hear doors banging, banging, closing and shutting. And he'd go down there to see, why is this door loose? Why is it banging in the wind? And the door would be locked securely. So he really began to bother him. And so he decided that he would tell his supervisor. So he sort of screwed up his courage and he went to his supervisor and said, I know this is going to sound stupid, but I really don't like working there by myself and being called out at night. There's some really weird stuff that's been happening. I've heard footsteps when there's no one there. I've heard these doors banging when they're securely locked. And his supervisor didn't laugh at him, but said, look, you're not the first. We think we know why it is. There's a crypt underneath the telephone exchange. Now, when I was told this story 10 years ago, it was just left there. And it was kind of like, are you telling me that there's a crypt underneath the telephone exchange? But I didn't think at the time to go and look into it and to see if that was true. And this is where the maps come in. So when I was researching this for the ghost walk, the physical ghost walk, I pulled up some of the old maps from 1880. And I'm going to zoom in on this map in a moment. But for those of you that can see it, we've got a yellow line, which is marking where there is a pub called the Pembroke Arms. It still exists. It still has the exact same footprint as it had in 1880. The orange blob that is on the map is where the telephone exchange is now, except it probably goes a little bit further back than I've drawn. And obviously, it starts further off the road. These houses were demolished, probably in the mid 20th century. And here, the pink blob is where Aldi is today. And again, that probably goes further back as well. But let me show you the zoomed in map. So we've got the Pembroke Arms here, the yellow line. We've got the orange denoting where the telephone exchange currently is. And we've got the pink outline of where Aldi is. And you might notice that there is a Baptist chapel marked on here as well. This Baptist chapel opened in the late 18th century after the fire, the Great Fire of Biggleswade. So we know that that was there in 1790. And right behind that Baptist church is a burial ground. So it is not inconceivable that underneath where the telephone exchange is today, there is in fact a crypt. It could be a wealthy Baptist who decided to build a crypt there. It could be that this burial ground is older than the Baptist church. It could be a non-conformist burial ground that has been in Biggleswade for a very long time. So that's the story of why there's a crypt underneath the telephone exchange. Now, I couldn't take you on a tour of Biggleswade without telling you about the haunted pound stretcher, and many of you will know this story from the podcast. But I wanted to show you some pictures from it at least. And I do want to make sure that we still have some time if we need it for questions. So I'm afraid I am going to have to rush this. And it's been a useful learning curve to realise that I probably need to make these talks 2 hours, not an hour and a half. So this is what the pound stretcher looked like when it existed. The history of the building is actually an interesting one. So here's another image of the pound stretcher taken from Street View back when it existed. It's not a pound stretcher now, it's Jones's Gym. But the story of the pound stretcher building is that it was in the 19th century briefly a school. Yeah, it was a music school. There was two older ladies who lived here, spinsters by themselves, and they taught music. But it was for most of its life a shop. It was a spirits merchants, not the kind of spirits that we're looking for, but for drinking. It was also for many, many years in the 20th century a furniture shop. Out the back, because it's a very long, thin building with more buildings at the back, and it leads all the way to the street that runs parallel, which was called Brewery Lane, but is now Church Street. And out the back, there was a print works for over 100 years based there. That is now part of the gym and was part of the pound stretcher storerooms. Now, briefly in the 1980s, for about 6 months, there was also an undertaker's there and a morgue. They were temporarily there before they moved to the market square. And yet everyone remembers that 6 months of there being a morgue at the back of these buildings. Now, I was going to tell you a little bit, very, very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, about the poltergeist activity in this building. Now, this is what the coffee shop looks like upstairs. And Aidan, who runs the Joneses gym and coffee shop, has tried to keep a lot of the original features, like the fireplace here behind where my head is and the brickwork. He really
Really
loves all
nice.
of that. Oh, um, anyway, the the areas of the shop that seemed to be most haunted were basically everywhere, but the attic and the cellar, and also the old office space upstairs. And this is where the old office used to be upstairs. It's on a little raised area. This is also where a lot of activity happened. Now, many of you will know the poltergeist scale, which Evelyn Hollow has kind of really developed and talks about on Uncanny. Well, the poltergeist activity here really follows that scale. I have spoken to a dozen women who worked at the Haunted Pound Stretcher, and their stories are consistent. Started with that feeling of presence that we've talked about a lot today, feeling as if you're not alone, that there's somebody watching you. And this was very prevalent up in this area in this office. One of the other things that they experienced after that first initial feelings of presence was
It looks really nice.
so one of the other feelings that they one of the other things, the next thing that happened after that was the actually hearing sounds, and it was voices that they heard. So this wasn't so much hearing footsteps, although that was reported, but they actually heard voices. There was one lady who worked there, and I gave her the name Mary because she wanted to remain anonymous. Can I just remind people to be muted before we because I will stop soon and we will get a chance for questions. But if everybody can make sure they've got um their microphones muted, that would be brilliant. Um, Mary would quite often be in the shop by herself, and she would hear her name being called, Mary, Mary, and it would really, really, creep her out because she would then go to find who it was that was calling her, and there would be nobody else in the shop. She also heard crying, and one day was convinced that there was a child locked in one of the storerooms because she could hear crying coming from that storeroom. And she was absolutely terrified they'd locked a customer's child in there. She went to open the storeroom, and as soon as she opened the door, it was silent. There was no one there. There was no child that had come in. The next poltergeist item on the scale, as such, after you've had the situation of hearing voices, is items moving. And these are items being moved around while you're not looking. So this happened all the time in the Pan Stretcher. They would come into work in the morning after leaving everything neat and tidy, and suddenly the place would be in disarray. And they likened it to being if a child had been in there, basically throwing cushions around, toys would be moved. And then the next thing that happened, and it's on that scale as well, is objects moving while you are looking at them. And I spoke to three women who witnessed this, where they saw coffee jars falling off shelves or even flying across the room off a shelf. And bags of sweets, big, heavy bags of sweets, would fall off the shelves all by themselves. So we're getting into the territory now where this really would be classed as poltergeist activity. But it didn't stop there. There were alarms going off at night when nobody had intruded. The lights in the men's toilets, there were no men's working there, so the lights were always switched off, would switch off and on, and it would be like they could watch it happening as they were switching the light off. It would suddenly switch itself back on again. Lots of really scary things like that were happening in the pan stretcher. And one of the things that doesn't come up in poltergeist cases that often is actually seeing an apparition. And Aggie has been seen. This is how she got her name. Now, there's a reason I've used the same image as the little girl that was seen at the Golden Pheasant, because there is a theory that Aggie may be haunting further afield than the just the pound stretcher. And there are many stories about little girl ghosts being seen around the centre of Biggleswade. So is it the same little girl moving from building to building? Now, Aggie has been seen the reason she has a name is that back in the 1970s, in that furniture shop that was there before the pound stretcher, a man was working there, and one afternoon he found a little girl sitting on the stairs at the back of the shop. Now, this was in a non-public area, so as he approached her, he was, going to say to her, "Why, you shouldn't be here. Where are your parents?" He described her as actually being older than the child that I've got the image of here. He thought that she was nearer to maybe sort of 12 or 13, that she was dressed in quite odd clothing for the 1970s. She was in like a long smock dress with an apron over the front. And as he approached her, she disappeared off the steps. Now, the furniture shop in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s was also having similar things happening with items going missing, things moving around, people hearing unexplained noises. And so they gave the activity a name, Aggie. And that name then stuck and was brought to the pound stretcher. Now, does Aggie still haunt Jones's coffee shop? As you can see, Jones's coffee shop really go in for all of this. They really embrace the fact that it's got a reputation for being haunted. This is their Halloween decorations. Now, I did do a ghost hunt at the pound stretcher, and I was I had a wonderful time at the. I'm just really conscious of time now that we're overrunning. So those of you that have to leave, I do understand that you might need to go, and I will obviously send to you a link so that you can watch the video afterwards. I'll send those links around tomorrow. But so if you do need to leave, you will catch the end of this. If you can stay for another 5 minutes, it will just be 5 minutes, I promise you. So I did a ghost hunt for, and you can hear it on the podcast, and we had a wonderful time. The coffee shop was open. Sorry, the coffee shop was shut. It'd just been refurbished, but the gym was open for 24 hours that day. And so we were allowed to come in, and we were there from 8 o'clock until 2 in the morning. We were, in fact, in the cellar, which was one of the places that was considered to be extremely haunted at midnight. And I will tell you a bit about the cellar in a moment. But we got to go in the attic, which was another space people didn't like going into when it was the pound stretcher. And we basically had the whole run of the building, and it was brilliant. Nothing very scary happened apart from a couple of things. So, the one thing that I can't explain happened in the attic. We'd set up all the recording equipment, we were getting comfy. I was just doing a bit of a spiel for the podcast. And I suddenly not only heard but felt a click next to my ear. Like somebody had like clicked their fingers really loudly, and I could feel that movement. And I said, "Oh, did anyone else hear that click?" Now, my friend Paul, who's in the blue jumper in the photograph, he was sitting sort of next to me at the end of the table in a similar position to how he's sitting in this photograph. And he said to me, "Oh gosh, yes, I heard that." But my two BBC colleagues, Liv and Lucy, did not hear it. But we said, okay, fair enough. We'd got two recording devices in there, my field recorder that was facing me and a microphone that was connected to Lucy's recorder that was also facing me. So we knew we'd pick it up, except we didn't pick up a thing. And I clearly say, "Oh, did you hear that?" And so we could play it back and listen over and over again, and no sound is picked up. And yet both Paul and I heard it. So it is very, very strange. Can't explain what that was. We do hear stories still from the staff about things that are happening in Jones's coffee shop and gym. There have been many staff who work there in the gym who do not know about Aggie. It wasn't something that was kind of passed on by the previous staff to them. And yet they will talk about that feeling that somebody's walked into the gym, come up behind them, they turn around, there's no one there. My favourite story, though, is about the coffee shop. And basically, what happens is the staff will clean up overnight. They make sure everything is completely spick and span, everything's gleaming. They come in the next morning, and there are little pyramids of coffee just dotted around. And they know that they weren't there before. So they believe that Aggie is still there, but we think she is, if you believe in ghosts and spirits, oh, excuse me, we believe that she is happier. So that's a really lovely kind of kind of if she is a ghost, this idea that she's now somewhere where she can watch people working out in the gym, she can watch people having cake and coffee and gossiping, and it's a much nicer environment than being in the pound stretcher. So we think it might be that she is happy, and that's why there's been less activity. And the activity that there has been quite harmless. So my last thing to show you is I'm going to have to, this side. There we go. I need to make myself disappear. This was written on the wall of the cellar when Jones's gym arrived. It had been left behind by the people from the pound stretcher, and it says, "Good luck, you'll need it." Nothing actually scary happened to us while we were in the cellar, actually. We had a great time down in the cellar. Yes, pyramids of coffee is quite unusual, though it did crop up in an uncanny episode that I remember. Yeah, I really love this. Good luck, you'll need it. It really is quite cool. I can make myself much smaller so that you can see it while I'm talking. I should have done that actually, made myself smaller. So yes, that was the message they left. Aidan and the gym owner and Sarah the manager both say they don't like going into the cellar. So thank you so much for your time. Oh, I've gone backwards. I wanted to wish you all a happy Christmas. This is not this year's tree. It's actually this year's tree in Biggleswade is looking a bit more splendid than this one. But yes, I wanted to say thank you so much for coming today and happy Christmas. I will end this slideshow now. I'm sorry that we overran. I'm sorry that I didn't get to tell you the final ghost story about Aggie and the pound stretcher in lots of detail. I realise it's a story that most of you know, but obviously there's new information coming out about it all the time. If anybody has got a burning question, I can stay around until 40 minutes past, and it's 37 now. So we've got sort of 3 minutes. But thank you so much for those of you that have enjoyed it. I do wish you all a really happy Christmas. If you can give me some feedback, other than obviously the technical issues, I'm going to try and sort out. I'm also going to try and sort out, obviously, the running time. I'll make it a 2 hour thing with a 10-minute break in the middle. If anybody's got any really, ideas about how to make it, better, bear in mind I might have some video as well, then please let me know. Thank you so much for sharing the links and things in the comments and your comments as we were going. It was brilliant. Again, just thank you so much for coming. What distance would be covered in real life? So in real life, the distance is exactly a mile. We walk around the centre of the town. We start in at the big theatre usually, and then we walk around basically a loop. And like I say, it takes us about 2 hours. We're stopping for ghost stories along the way. Most of the ghost stories that I covered today, we do cover. There's a few that I didn't cover today. And there are seats at every stop that we stop at, apart from one. So I make sure that there are seats there for people to sit on. We've had people with quite limited mobility come along on the walks and wheelchair users. There's not necessarily drop curbs everywhere, but I wish there were, but we've managed. So it is it's not a really long walk. There are definitely, lots and lots of places within a short distance. If you're coming through on Friday, do stop and have a look around. Go and grab a coffee if you can at Jones's gym. Thank you so much for those of you that have enjoyed it and that have come along. Have a wonderful Christmas. If there are any stories about on the podcast about Backstreet and the old scrapyard, Mel, yes, there are. I have discovered something very important about it, and I will cover it in the podcast. But if you want to know more, or if you live there, because that I'm trying to find somebody that lives along that where those flats are now on Backstreet, please let me know. Thank you so much that you enjoyed the virtual ghost walk. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad the slides worked. Thank you so much. please, at this point, please leave if you want to. I'm not going to keep you here any longer. I'm not going to close the chat yet because I'm just going to try and work out how I save the chat, because that also is going to be really useful, because it obviously doesn't come up when you save the videos. I will send a link around tomorrow for you to see the video. That would be brilliant. But bye, everybody. Have a wonderful Christmas and have a wonderful evening. Like I say, I'm not going to end the meeting just yet, but please leave if you need to, because I need to work out how I save the chat. Thank you, everyone, and take care. Have a really wonderful Christmas. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.